Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Cheryl Milne. I'm the Executive Director of the David Asper Center for Constitutional Rights, and welcome to our Constitutional Roundtable. I wish first of all to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And though many of you are from across Canada, so also on the lands of many of the peoples, the First Nations and Indigenous peoples from across Canada. I want to welcome you to our second Constitutional Roundtable for this academic term. This webinar is being recorded and a link will be shared in the coming days. Professor Hirschl will talk for about 40 minutes. And 45 minutes, and there will be about 20 minutes for question and answer following his presentation. We ask that you put your questions in the Q&A, and I will be following those and moderating the questions and try to get to as many as we can in the time that we have at the end for questions. So please just type them in. You can type them in throughout, and I will be monitoring. There will be a link to a paper that Professor Hirschl provided, which covers many of the themes of the book that he will be talking about today, and that's going to be put in the chat by Tal Schreier. So Professor Hirschl is a professor of political science and law and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. His research interests focus on comparative public law, and in particular, the intersection of comparative politics and comparative constitutionalism. He's the author of 4 books. The book today that he'll be talking about, City, State, Constitutionalism, and the Megacity. Comparative Matters, the Renaissance of Comparative Constitutional Law, which was a winner of an award in 2015. The Herman Pritchett Award for the best book on law and courts. Constitutional Theocracy, also a winner of the Mahoney Prize in Legal Theory, and Towards Juristocracy, the Origins and Consequences of the New Constitutionalism, as well as over 100 articles and book chapters on comparative constitutionalism and judicial review, the political sociology of public law, the judicialization of politics, constitutional law and religion, and the intellectual history of comparative constitutional inquiry. He has received many awards for his research and teaching. His work on the intersection of public law and comparative politics has been translated into various languages, discussed in numerous scholarly fora, cited in high court decisions, and addressed in media venues from the New York Times to the Jerusalem Post. I see him shaking his head saying, you've gone on too long. So with that, I could go on for much more, but I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Professor Hirschl. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for this generous introduction. Thank you to the Asper Center for hosting this talk and for inviting me to provide some comments. And of course, thanks to everyone for tuning in during what I'm sure is not an easy time for anyone. Let me, before I begin the talk itself, just share the screen here with you. And I hope everyone can see the title page. So what I'm going to talk about in the next 45 minutes or so is on the 2 or 3 of the main themes of a recently published book of mine, City, State, Constitutionalism in the Megacity, published with Oxford University Press, I believe back in June, July. And the background to this book goes back to, of course, the slashing of the Toronto City Council episode 2.5 years ago in summer 2018. And like several other constitutional law faculty members in our school, I was approached by a number of journalists asking me to comment on the decision, and in particular, because I work in the area of comparative constitutional law, what's the comparative background to the status of Toronto and to Canadian cities in general? And frankly, at the time, I couldn't think of a single book that does that. So I set out to write that book. And I am going now to present to you a number of themes that I cover in that book. So without further ado, let's just delve into the presentation itself. So it is common knowledge here in Toronto and in Canada that Canadian cities are viewed as creatures of the provinces, and you won't have the time to go into details, and you know all of that. It was affirmed in a string of court decisions from the Supreme Court to provincial courts. And the situation currently in Canada is that the Constitution adopted over 150 years ago in the middle 19th century, when Toronto's population was less than 50,000 actually, governs a nation that is very urban, where the 55 or so % of the population live in 6 metropolitan areas, including our own metropolis region that is home to approximately 20% of Canada's population and to every second immigrant to Canada. So to say that we have some constitutional datedness here is probably an understatement. And some have gone on to argue that the current situation may be in violation of some of the core constitutional principles governing our country, as elucidated by the Supreme Court in the Quebec secession reference. And of course, we see at the bottom of the slide our founding fathers, and I picked this picture because, of course, they're all male, all white, and if we look through the window, we definitely don't see a megacity there. So obviously, the megacity or even the urban agenda was not on top of these brilliant thinkers at the time. But in following the footsteps of Justice Isabella and others in a concurring opinion rendered last week by the Supreme Court, I'm going to introduce the Canadian Constitution and to place it in a slightly more comparative, broader perspective, so as to take the Canadian discussion beyond its traditional national confinements. So let's roll. This is a graph that is available online. It's not part of the book, but it's obvious. And it tells the story of urbanization over the past 500 years. It need not be explicated any further. And we can see that over the last 200 years, the world has witnessed tremendous urbanization pretty much everywhere. But this graph is my own doing. And here I zoom in on the last 70 years with projection for the next 30 or so. And the story here may be more detailed. The purple line on top is world population in billions. And the blue line at the bottom is urban population in billions. And we see that the purple line and the blue line here are almost parallel to each other. The only translation to this is that the vast majority of growth in world population translates into tremendous growth in the world's urban population, currently estimated at roughly 4.3, 4.5 billion, and estimated to rise to approximately 7 billion by 2050. This is another way of showing the data and the rise of urban population and the relative decline of rural population worldwide. This may seem daunting at first glance, but really it's not. The left-hand half of the table shows the proportion of urban population of total population by continent and by time, over time. If we look at the right half of the table, it provides some data on the actual size of urban population in millions worldwide. And we can see that if we look at the bottom two lines there, the growth in Asia is tremendous, as well as in Africa. There has been some growth in Europe and North America, but to a lesser degree for obvious reasons. This is another way of showing the same data, and we can see that the green line here represents a growth in urban population in Asia, the orangish line in Africa, and the silver line in Latin America. And there is some more moderate growth in Europe and North America. But clearly the so-called global South has taken the lead in terms of urbanization. And we will get back to this later when we talk about constitutional solutions to the situation. This is yet another way of showing the same data. Over the last 60 years, approximately 88% of urban growth took place in the so-called global South. And the projection for the near future is that approximately 96% of the urban growth from now until 2050 will take place in the global South. This simple line shows the rise of megacities over time. So obviously, this is an inevitable byproduct of urbanization, the growth of megacities. So let's zoom in on some of the more specific numbers here on megacity expansion. And you can see that merely a century ago, the number of cities with population over 1 million was in the teens. It now is around 550, 600. And in 10 years, it will have reached 1,000. And the rise of megacities worldwide is only going to increase. The projections at the bottom of the slide, the projections for the next century or to the end of the 21st century are frankly near dystopian. And UN projections suggest that by the end of the 21st century, we will have cities such as Lagos, Kinshasa, Dar es Salaam, Mumbai, Karachi, with population between 70 and 85, perhaps even more million people. So that clearly is quite a phenomenon. Another byproduct of this phenomenon that we will get to later is the tremendous rise of extreme density. So we don't know how fortunate we are in Toronto. The overall density throughout the city of Dhaka, this is not just one neighborhood, this is the capital of Bangladesh, is 46,000 people per square kilometer. And as I say here, so that you appreciate the density here, this is equivalent to squeezing 260 million people into PI. Good luck with that. And we see when we compare it to other major cities around the world, including Toronto, the numbers are absolutely stunning, again, bordering on dystopian. But this is not, but wait, there is more. And when we look at urban slums, so to speak, I don't like this word, but it's often used. We see density that is even higher than that, with the dubious world record holder here, Dharavi in Mumbai, with an average density of 300,000 people per square kilometer, and that's equivalent of squeezing the entire world population into the state of Vermont, or 1.5 billion people, again, not million, billion, 1.5 billion people in PI. Of course, that's another simple illustration of the same data. We have here representation of population density in Los Angeles, in Hong Kong, that is considered by many one of the densest cities in the world, Dhaka, that, as I said, the densest city in the world, and the population in Dharavi, Mumbai. This is how these global South cities, or some of them, actually look. So this photo was taken at the outskirts of Lagos, Nigeria. This was taken at in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And this is Mumbai, and we will talk about those socioeconomic gaps in a few minutes. So this is the reality of urbanization worldwide. Clearly not a uniquely Canadian phenomenon. So what I do in the book to address this phenomenon from a constitutional standpoint, because that's what I do. I study constitutional law. So I cover in the book 5 major themes. One is the gap between the extensive study of the urban scene in the human sciences, political science, sociology, economics, geography, and so on, and the virtual silence in constitutional thought. And I ask, why is it that constitutional thought up to date has not paid much attention to this significant phenomenon? The second question I ask is, what do constitutions say and do not say about cities? Then I address the constitutional law and politics of city status, and I identify that virtually all attempts at enhancing the constitutional status of cities have taken place in the so-called global south. And so I asked what may explain the divergent north-south path on this. The fourth thing that I do in the book is I turn to constitutional/political theory, and I try to materialize or realize Henri Lefebvre's right to the city and ask, can cities serve as constituent units in constitutional theory? Can we reimagine a constitutional world where cities get enhanced constitutional status qua unique constituent units? And those of you who are not familiar with Henri Lefebvre's work on this, this is a major concept in urban studies, coined in the late 60s, has not been invoked frequently by constitutional scholars. It is a rather fuzzy term. Again, as I said, more normative and philosophical than legal and constitutional. And what I try to do in the book, or in that part of the book, is to give it concrete constitutional meaning. And so what I do here is I ask what makes cities unique, things like density, superdiversity, massive inequality, subsidiarity, stakeholding theory, and so on. What cities aim to do, measures such as urban citizenship, human rights, cities, international city networks, and so on, and what concepts and doctrines from constitutional law may be put forward in support of granting cities enhanced constitutional standing. And then finally, what I do in the book is I try to invoke constitutional design in envisioning innovative constitutional means for addressing the rural-urban divide. So let's delve into 2 or 3 of these themes to the extent that our time permits. So first, the gap between the social and human sciences and constitutional law. So classical works of political theory, many of us are familiar with these works and no need to rehearse those now, address the city. The city has been the center, the conceptual center of many utopian works of social thought, from late medieval to early 20th century works. And more recently, the city has been the center of novel thinking about urbanization, of course, by, I mentioned already, Henri Lefebvre, but also a name that many of you have heard of, Saskia Sassen, her famous work on global cities, economists, including Paul Krugman and others, Glaser, on economies of scale and urban agglomeration. Our U of T colleague, Richard Florida, his famous work on cities and the creative classes. And of course, and others, Benjamin Barber's work, If Mayors Ruled the World. So by a stark contrast, very little of this intellectual flurry has penetrated constitutional law, let alone comparative constitutional law, where the city is virtually non-existent. And constitutions reflect here an overwhelmingly statist outlook. I'll get to that in a minute. So here are 3 major reference books published relatively recently on comparative constitutional law. And I, for the sake of full disclosure, I'm among the contributors to 2 of those. So I'm as responsible for this neglect as anyone else. And here together we have a total of more than 130 chapters stretched over more than 2,500 pages without a single chapter on the constitutional status of cities home to the majority of the world's population. So clearly we have a major gap here in comparative constitutional scholarship. So, as I said earlier, the first thing I try to do in the book is to speculate why is this constitutional blind spot, what's its origins, and I come up with 4 possible explanations. Perhaps there are more. The first is, of course, constitutional rigidity and path dependence. Obviously, constitutions are, number one, some of them, including our own, adopted many years ago before the megacity phenomenon started to take place. Of course, they're difficult to amend, as here in Canada, path dependence and so on. And if I may say so, there may be some path dependence among scholars who just do not pay attention to this phenomenon. A second idea is the idea of spatial statism, the idea that constitutions, certainly national constitutions by their very nature, represent a Westphalian statist outlook that is embedded in them. And so constitutional thought is not very keen on addressing spatial issues from a non-statist standpoint. And we can get back to this theoretical point later. There is this embedded statism in contemporary constitutional thought. A third idea that I develop is that cities are or may be viewed by states from a sociological standpoint, from a political standpoint, as potential competitors. In particular, fear of large cities as potential sites of mass mobilization. And we've seen this over the last few years, a few months ago in the US, but elsewhere as well, in Hong Kong, in Santiago de Chile, in Cairo, etc. And we know this from Paris in the times of the French Revolution. So cities have this confluence of density, proximity, government buildings, public spaces. They are sites of potential revolution, and states are not keen on that. And finally, large cities are consistently more diverse, cosmopolitan, and socially progressive. And I have a short list of cities here that are considerably more progressive and cosmopolitan than the rest of the polity. And I should say that in Istanbul and Budapest, two of the in Turkey and Hungary, 2 of the countries that are often cited as current sites of ethno-nationalist populism and populist leaders, etc. Both Istanbul and Budapest elected over the last few months anti-regime mayors by a landslide. Okay, so the first theme of the book is the constitutional silence and why this may be the case. Let's now move to talk about the second part of the book that may be of interest to scholars of comparative constitutional law. What is the status of the city in national constitutions? And so the obvious comparator that many Canadian scholars look at is the US, but unfortunately, it is not going to provide any hope for those of us who think that Canadian cities should be empowered constitutionally. So in the US, doctrines that date back to the 19th century and to, we don't have the time to go into details, unfortunately, and to big decisions of the US Supreme Court dating back to the early 20th century continue to govern the constitutional situation south of the border concerning cities, and cities are practically powerless. Consequently, we've seen extensive preemptive state legislation in the US whereby state governments preempt progressive legislation by cities on anything from minimum wage, sick leave, sanctuary cities, anti-tobacco, soda tax, gun control, you name it, reproductive freedoms, you name it. Of course, many of us are familiar with extensive gerrymandering to suppress city voice. And the US Supreme Court ruled last year that gerrymandering is a political question, not a constitutional question. And so it's not justiciable question, to put it differently, and it ought to be resolved by politicians, not by the court. What we have here, this bizarre creature here, is not a picture of a virus, although it may look like it. It's a congressional district in Texas, and you can see here, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, it was actually created by Democrats to enhance city representation, but we see here this odd attempt to connect Austin here with San Antonio here so as to enhance urban representation. Anyways, gerrymandering is a big problem. And of course, we have south of the border, systemic sellout of urban assets to corporations. Again, we can't go into details, but some of us may be familiar with the Amazon HQ2 bid that many American cities try to lure Amazon to their jurisdiction, offering tax incentives and infrastructure incentives in billions in terms of the, we have to the bottom left of the slide, you see part of the Boston presentation. This is Boston. This is the home of, Harvard, Cambridge, and other, just essentially selling itself to Amazon. And to the right, and we have this slide that depicts some of the really surreal Chicago Morgan Stanley deal. Chicago was completely, empty in terms of cash a few years ago, and it signed a desperate deal with Morgan Stanley, and for a little more than $1 billion, it's sold all its parking rights to Morgan Stanley until 2083. That's right. Morgan Stanley is going to recoup its investment in a year, leaving 62 years of net earnings. So every time you park your car in Chicago, think about that. Okay, so not the US, then perhaps Australia is a source of inspiration, but not really. And the only bright side here is that it may well be that the status of big Australian cities is even worse than the status of Canadian cities, to the extent that this is possible. Again, we can't go into details. I explain all of this in the paper, and Tal will be happy to share it with you if she hasn't already. But Australian cities, much like their Canadian cities, are completely at the mercy of states, even though they have to deal and provide services to the large majority of population in each of these states. So by contrast to the stalemate or stagnation in the global north, we've seen some interesting attempts that may be a source of inspiration to Canadian constitutional scholars in the so-called global south. And so the first question we have to ask ourselves is, why is this happening? And of course, we can speculate that there is the necessity here. Over 95% of urban growth takes place in the global south, as we saw earlier. And of course, greater constitutional flexibility, newer constitutional orders, some of them, as we'll see in a minute, emanating from major political transformation. And so there is this combination of greater constitutional flexibility with perhaps political will. And this is combination that we certainly do not have in Canada. There is no constitutional flexibility, and there is not much political will, not here and not south of the border, in terms of enhancing city status. So 3 of the major attempts in the global south to address the city issue, urbanization issue, come from Brazil, and I address all of this in great detail in the paper, so those of you who are interested in more details should read the paper. Brazil, that as part of its constitutional revolution in 1988, transitioned from military regime to a democracy, enshrined the right to the city in its constitution for the first time in modern constitutionalism. It has been a very interesting experiment. Again, I discussed this in some length in the paper, its consequences and effects. It also adopted a city statute in something like 16, 17 years ago. Unfortunately, that city statute was repealed by Bolsonaro the first week of his coming to office, which tells you what's the politics for and against the idea of the right to the city. A second interesting attempt, far less successful, comes from India. India adopted 2 constitutional amendments in 93, protecting the status of local government, 73, and big cities, 74. And this is a big issue that we can return to later. What's the difference between local government and big cities? And perhaps the most successful attempt today via constitutionalism to protect city rights comes from South Africa. So it's part of an entire chapter in the South African Constitution. This is unprecedented and the most ambitious attempt to date in world constitutionalism. This was an attempt, emanating directly from the idea that South African constitutional framers wanted to explicitly reverse the apartheid-related urban policy. We can talk about it in the Q&A. And it granted city control over land use, planning, social housing, and other things. We'll see the consequences later. Another very interesting attempt that also comes from the so-called Global South is the constitutionalization of Mexico City. So up until a few years ago, Mexico City was a federal territory governed directly by the federal government, and as in a combination of political maneuvering and constitutional innovation and a process of public consultation, in 2017, it turned into a state and lost its, with full support of its residents. It's no longer a federal territory. It is a state, much like exactly like any other Mexican state. That required a revision of 2 articles in the federal constitution, as well as an adoption of a new constitution to Mexico City. And this is to date the largest, over 20 million, experiment in constitution making via moderated crowdsourcing. In national constitutionalism, there's lots of literature on Iceland as an example for that. But the truth is that Mexico City, the numbers far exceed those of Iceland, obviously. Let's now move on to discuss the third part of what I'll do in the book, and that's probably the last angle I'll address in this short talk. So we've seen so far that there is a gap between the social science literature and the constitutional law literature, and I try to address why. And we also saw that if we harbor any hope for getting some ideas from overseas on how to amend our constitution, we should look to the Global South. And that point by itself is a novel point, because obviously the conventional wisdom is that when it comes to constitutional thought, it is the global North that ought to educate, quote unquote, or teach the Global South. But when it comes to city status, it's exactly the opposite. And the experience of the Global South and most of the innovation comes from countries such as Brazil, India, South Africa, and Mexico, not from our usual suspect comparators such as the US, Australia, or elsewhere. Let's now talk about the third theme. Some of the constitutional theory arguments that may be put forward in support of enhanced city power. So one of the issues that I address is the issue I term in the book, one person, half a vote. So our Canadian students and those who are familiar with the Canadian constitutional scene obviously are familiar with the first point here. And I'm not going to go into details. I shall just say that this is by no means a uniquely Canadian problem. And that as a matter of fact, the problems in India and Brazil that we just addressed are at least as significant. And just one example here, let me zoom in. So Mumbai, that is about 25% of the state of Maharashtra, due to constitutional malapportionment problem, has merely 1/8 of the MPs representing the state. And so it's basically literally one person, half a vote. And when we look to the broader theoretical picture here, there is an increasing number of political science accounts that suggest that in first past the post electoral systems, the underrepresentation of urban voters and the urban voice is systemic or structural or organic to the first past the post electoral system structure. And obviously we can't go into details, but I'm happy to provide references to these works as we go along. And of course, there is also the Chicago-Zurich problem, as I call it in the book, so progressive cities that are subsumed by subnational units. What I do in that part of the book, I try to envision some electoral system designs that we may consider. Some of them are already in existence, some of them are my own development, and some of you may be familiar with some of these ideas, you know, PR and the rural-urban proportional representation, and of course the joint mixed urban-rural districts. That's an idea that I try to push, and the idea that comes from Switzerland of split cantons, you know, the city of Basel and the rest of the Basel canton, non-territorial federalism, etc. Of course, mixed member proportional representation and other ideas. We don't have to go. We don't have the time to go into details. Another idea that I raise in that part of the book, the more, you know, constitutional theory oriented, is the constituent unit question. What are the already existing doctrines or ideas in constitutional law that may be invoked in thinking about large cities as constituent units in at least federalism and perhaps in every state? And of course, these are ideas that are familiar to many of us, you know, stakeholding theory, the idea that the more affected people are by a decision, the greater their representation in taking that decision should be, and subsidiarity, the idea that's closely related, that decisions should be made, at the level that is closest possible to the people. And of course, we have other ideas such as community standards and margin of appreciation, that is essentially a variation on the theme commonly invoked in European and transnational human rights law. All of these ideas and more, I don't have the time to go into details, may be invoked in the context of thinking creatively about cities as constituent units. There are many manifestations of these ideas in public law. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Many of these ideas already exist that just have not been invoked in this context. Quickly to another idea that we may be thinking about creatively. So this graph may be familiar to many of you who work in fiscal federalism. Of course, the idea of equalization and spending and all those things. And here we see, you know, pre and post equalization transfers, interprovincial in Canada. So of course, the basis here is the traditional subnational unit, or the province here in Canada, or the state in other countries, or the Länder in Germany, etc. But it so happens that the differences in inequality and income interprovincial are far smaller than the differences intra-provincial, and even more so intra-metropolis. So when we talk about huge cities, we may well be shifting our attention, or at least complementing our attention, to inter-provincial transfers with in some novel thinking about intra-provincial and, even more importantly, intra-city or intra-metropolis transitions. Another idea that I explore quickly in the book is the idea of superdiversity. So this is a notion commonly invoked by sociologists to describe the urban situation, the urban condition, if you will. And one of the clear markers of difference in big cities is superdiversity. So superdiversity essentially means the intersection of many more traditional lines of diversity. So we cannot just talk about racial diversity, ethnic diversity, religious diversity, linguistic diversity, gender diversity, sexual preference, and so on and so forth, age, and so on. We can talk about a mix, a closely knit nexus of intersections among various types of diversity that creates the situation of super diversity that is quite unique to the urban scene. And so I have lots of data in the book, but an idea to consider is the idea that cities may be different because of this super diversity reality and all the difficulties in terms of integration and multiculturalism on the ground that the city scene has to deal with and city authorities have to deal with. Nearing the end, another idea that I explore in the book is the idea of environmental protection and why we should empower constitutionalist cities and the climate change looming crisis and environmental protection as one of the reasons why we should think about cities as decision makers that have more power to do things. And of course, the growing majority of the world's population resides in cities. It is impossible to meaningfully address either rising economic inequality, as we saw earlier, or climate change without direct involvement of city government. And so the constitutional empowerment of cities may be thought of as an effective means for addressing the problem in a more bottom-up fashion, closer to the ground, so to speak. Notion. And one of the examples I explore here is the example of Buenos Aires that was granted constitutional status in 94, 95, and over the last 25 years emerged as one of the world's leaders and one of the world's greenest cities to date. Maybe a final argument that I'll explore is in this forum is the idea of contribution to social housing. So the evidence here is clear. The more constitutional power cities hold, the greater the likelihood that they'll invest in social housing. And the example that I analyze in some detail in the book, and we referred to it earlier, is the example of South Africa. Again, the most innovative and radical to date attempt to reconceptualize the entire notion of intergovernmental affairs and carving a place for cities in it. And it's probably the best source of inspiration for Canadian innovators, in my humble opinion. So here, obviously, we need not just constitutional text. We need courts to interpret those constitutional texts in a favorable, generous, and supportive fashion. And that's exactly what the South African Constitutional Court has done. It has supported these attempts big time. And one of the most important decisions in that context is a decision dating back to 2010, where the South African Constitutional Court confirmed once and for all that cities have exclusive, and I underscore exclusive, authority over municipal planning, including zoning and land use management. And so as a reaction, immediately after the decision, the city of Johannesburg adopted a policy whereby every residential construction site cannot get approval unless it is committed to including 30% affordable homes. Again, regardless of the project's location, including downtown, business neighborhoods, etc. So as a result, Johannesburg is the recipient of numerous international awards. This is not to suggest that the problem of socioeconomic gaps in Johannesburg have been resolved, but it is to suggest that if we grant major cities constitutional status, the likelihood that they'll address the social housing shortage is higher. To conclude, there's lots on the table. Urban agglomeration is among the most burning policy challenges of the 21st century. Again, as I hope I've shown, the current figures are mind-boggling. And Canada is merely one case in a much broader picture. So it's not only that it is puzzling to me, why is it that constitutional law has not paid sufficient, not even close to sufficient attention to the problem of urban agglomeration? It is also that Canadian scholars who have paid attention to the issue, and I salute them all, should probably broaden their horizon of inquiry to look at what other countries have been doing in this context. To my knowledge, this is not to say I have conclusive evidence to this, but to my knowledge, and you can count on it, this is the first book that tries to bring a comparative perspective to the issue of urbanization and how constitutional law should go about addressing it. I do suggest that there is one thing we should conclude with. One insight that probably all of you should take from this book is that the continued silence of constitutional thought and constitutional scholarship on the issue of cities, urbanization, is just striking. And in my humble opinion, this is one of the top 2-3 major challenges our humanity will be facing and already is facing in the next century. We absolutely need to turn our attention to this problem. And new thinking, as I say here, about constitutionalism and urbanization is the call of the hour. So what I do in the book, I try to extend an invitation. This is not a one-man thing. Obviously, the book serves as an invitation for many other scholars to begin explore this issue, or to continue to explore this issue in a broad, comparative, and theoretical perspective, so that we can all converge on a set of plausible solutions and justifications for addressing the urban challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron. That was a very interesting talk, and we have a number of questions. We may not get to them all, but we also have some really fascinating questions being asked. So the first one, there are two questions together from Nathalie de Rosier. Do you think that the fiction of cities as creatures of the province, so very focused on Canadian law, could be challenged and even reversed with arguments of the constitutional living tree? And the second question that goes along with that is, could the principle of subsidiarity be useful here?
Yes, so the answer to both questions, and thank you to Natalie and to whomever asked the second question. If it's Natalie, then great, and if it's someone else, great too, is yes with a capital Y. First of all, living tree is precisely, I mean, that we cannot now open a full discussion of what living tree means, but if we are consistent about the living tree interpretive approach, then definitely this is the case to apply it. And if you've read, and I'm sure you have, the decision of the, OCA from 2019, the final decision on the city council fiasco, you can see that the majority, I believe it was a 3-2 decision, and you can see that the majority, that's exactly the core of the difference between the majority and the dissenting opinion there. So the majority says, this is the Constitution. We do not believe in living tree in this context, and it refers back to, those black letterish provisions from 1867. And this was the framers' intent in that context, etc. So we don't see any reason to intervene here. But if you look at the dissenting opinion, it's pretty expressive in saying that maybe the time has come to invoke the living tree interpretive approach to assess how reasonable it is to continue to stick to, a constitutional vision framed when the city of Toronto had some 47,000 people to govern a metropolis that has now over 7 million people. And as I said, 20% of Canada's population. So the bottom line answer to that question, if has ever been a justification for a living tree method or mode of interpretation, it is precisely in this context, because this is not like freedom of speech where the arguments have not changed dramatically. Of course, we have new modes of expression, but the arguments have not, for and against, have not changed dramatically. This is a situation where the reality itself has changed in 181 degrees. It could not be more expressed. And the same is on the same league like the environmental challenge that was absolutely not known to our constitutional framers and is at the forefront of governance challenge today in Canada and worldwide. So my answer to the first part of Natalie's question is definitely yes. Living Tree, this is the place to apply it. It is meant for this. And the second, subsidiarity, and I discussed this in the book, and I just touched upon it in the presentation. Absolutely, subsidiarity is exactly the idea, and it has some traces. I wouldn't go as far as suggesting that subsidiarity is an established doctrine in Canadian constitutional law, but definitely we have some rulings of the Supreme Court of Canada that refer to subsidiarity. It's not as well developed as in other countries or in constitutional settings. I mean, in Germany, for example, this is on the books. It's in the Constitution. And in the European Treaty, you know, Maastricht, Lisbon, subsidiarity is up there. It is a major principle of interpretation. But definitely, even in the Canadian context, I would urge our leading constitutional litigators and thinkers to think more creatively about exactly the two parts of your question, the living tree interpretation mode and how to invoke it in this context, and the subsidiarity idea and how to make it applicable in the context of city governance.
Great, thank you. I have to say that as the Asper Center is very proud to be part of that decision and cited in the dissent.
That's great.
And the next question comes from Howard Katz from Cleveland, Ohio. So we have, we're reaching far today for our audience. It says, as a professor who previously held senior positions in local government, I'm well aware of the problem of preemption. In my former life, subprime predatory lending is one issue where the state overruled home rule municipalities. However, one argument often made in favor of state versus local power is that municipalities will not consider regional concerns. For example, sprawl and low-income housing. If Canadian cities had more autonomy, could there be such problems?
Yes. So first of all, thanks to our listener south of the border, and you can even now, you know, tell us your county, not just your city. We'll know everything about it. Who hasn't seen CNN and the guy there? Yeah, all that. So we definitely know all there is to know for non-Americans about the American challenges in this context. And this is an excellent question. And I think it boils down to a difference that I try to address in the book between perhaps a conceptual difference between local government and large urban centers. And so some constitutions do protect the rights of local government as an order of government. The challenge with such constitutions or such constitutional designs is that they do not take seriously the difference, and I argue that there is a difference between small villages or small towns and cities of millions with a population that far exceeds the population of whole countries. And so the issue of regional considerations and regional planning is definitely something that the megacity or the urban region or metropolis has to take into account. And that's exactly my intent in enshrining the constitutional status of such settings, as opposed to exactly what you say, local government, whereby, you know, small, relatively small towns and cities tend not to take into account regional development and considerations. But a word of caution here. In an alternative model that I explore in the book, and I didn't want to touch upon it here because it's sort of slightly different issue, is the so-called Asian tigers model of protecting cities. So it so happens that in countries such as China, South Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, and to some extent Japan, major cities have been empowered constitutionally, but not in a bottom-up, pro-democracy, progressive sense that I preach for, or the South African constitution does, or the Brazilian constitution, but rather as a means city autonomy as a means for economic development. So there is a bit of a trade-off here, and at the expense of other issues such as local voice, etc. So essentially, the mayor of Beijing is equivalent in his status to any other minister in the national government in China. So they sit next to the Minister of Agriculture and Development and Economic and so on. So it's all part of a national scheme. It's not aimed at enhancing city status or city residents' power or anything like that. Quite the contrary. So we need to strike a balance, and I try to do this in the book, between localities thinking about their own incentives and interests in a narrow way, and precisely what you suggest, the broader picture. And I hope I make some suggestions for how megacities may be written into, or the status of megacities may be written into national constitutions in a way that gives them more autonomy and taxation power. That's another issue we haven't had a chance to talk about, but at the same, and representation, but at the same time without losing sight of the larger picture. Thanks.
Great. This next question pertains to India. And the questioner says, I would like to ask you about your point about local government that you tagged while talking about the 73rd and 74th amendments, and more specifically to clarify, how is the question of local government different from that of urban governance?
Yes, so what the Indian, I believe I just started to address this issue, but let me zoom in on the issue, on the Indian matrix that has not been nearly as successful as the examples I brought from Brazil, South Africa, and Mexico. That, of course, depends on how we define success. So I define success as enhancing city status. And what happened, not just de jure, if you will, but de facto. So the real impact of those new constitutional provisions. And the impact in India has been modest at best. And I talked to dozens of constitutional law experts in India. And the general sense is that what Amendment 74 does is it essentially assigns to leaders of governors of Indian states the right to, it sets a threshold of 1 million people, every city with, it used to be 500,000, now million people and more, which in the Indian context is not to say too much. There are quite a few of those. And it assigns to state governors, all politicians, the exclusive discretion to assign a status to that city according to Amendment 74 or not. So it basically doesn't have an objective automatic application of city status in that context. So what this has done is essentially shifted the power. It essentially worsened the situation in a way. It created an Ontario situation in India. So it essentially allowed politicians who govern Indian states to decide whether a certain city should enjoy a constitutional status or not. So you can imagine all the problems. The most obvious ones, given the current political rift in India, is when the mayor and the head of state are of the same party, then of course that city gets constitutional status. And when they are not, then not, etc. In terms of Amendment 73, that covers smaller towns and villages. That has been considerably more successful because it allowed small villages to form village councils that have some constitutional status and to have some representation at the state level. But again, this does not cover major cities, some of which are amongst the world's largest. So basically, the Indian amendment failed to disconnect the politics from the constitutional status. And so it's not an objective thing that applies across the board. Unlike South Africa, where even in cases of split political rift between the government and the mayor or the city council, the constitution applies across the board.
And the next question is, assuming you are aware of the Charter City Initiative in Toronto, what is your critique and what advice would you share to overcome the barriers you identified to constitutionalizing Canadian cities?
So this is something that I do not address in the book, and it is not straightforward constitutional law. And I should say at the outset that I'm happy to hear your ideas about it. So my analysis is confined to the constitutional level, and there's so much to address from a constitutional standpoint that what I try to do, and let me be clear on what my position is here. I'm not suggesting that we replace the national constitutional order with a city-based constitutional order. I am suggesting that we carve, so I'm not talking about secession here, city secession. I am suggesting that the current situation worldwide and definitely in Canada certainly invites us to think creatively about carving a space for cities in national constitutions, including our own. I'm not advocating here a back to medieval times, city-state, etc. Hence, the title of the book is not city-state, with calling, but city, state, in how to reimagine the relations between city and state. On the city charter, I will say, and I have a full chapter that addresses some of the issues, not specifically in Toronto. Look, this is a book in comparative constitutional law, and obviously I'm based in Toronto, and there are some 20, 30 pages on Toronto politics, etc. So I didn't want the book to come across as focusing on Canada while it professes to be comparative. So I didn't want to go into details. I do not address the charter issue head on, the city charter. I will say that quite a few cities worldwide try to carve a space for themselves sort of at the margins, if not outside of the constitutional territory. So what they try to do, some cities toyed with the idea of city-based citizenship, as in, as a means for addressing illegal immigration, sanctuary cities, and especially south of the border. Ideas such as human rights cities, cities that incorporate into their city ordinances commitments to international human rights standards. In the context of climate change, that has been probably the most significant, in particular as American mayors, so mayors of big American cities have, come forward in a direct defiance of the Trump administration policy of retreating and, seceding from all those international treatments concerning environmental protection. And oddly enough, it is precisely because environmentalism, environmental protection, is not covered explicitly in the Canadian Constitution or in the American Constitution. That's precise lacuna is what allows cities to expand their attempts to govern that idea, because they don't hit the constitutional wall all the time. So we have this strange and counterproductive situation where, precisely because there is constitutional silence on the issue of environmentalism, cities can do more in that respect than they can do in other areas. So the bottom line is, I leave the question of Toronto City Charter to people who know much more about it. The focus of the book has been more on the national and comparative constitutional setting, and that's what I do.
In light of your just last comment about climate, there's a sort of a question that you may have really answered in it, but I'm just going to, it's also from Natalie DeRose. In a recent climate conference and preparing for Glasgow, is the idea of giving status to cities to participate in climate change conferences a way to support their constitutional empowerment and the momentum for action? Is that a way to start?
I believe so, yes. And it's definitely one of the strategies to begin to change the status quo on the ground without waiting for change from above to occur. So look, I'm not suggesting that all those international networks and international agreements that cities sign etc., are going to necessarily amend the constitutional status of cities tomorrow morning in Canada. But there's definitely a way to think about these activities that more and more cities in Canada and elsewhere engage with, of enhancing their, let's call it, foreign affairs portfolio. So engage with city-to-city agreements, with multi-city international networks, again, in the context of environmental protection in particular. And so some of those international or public international law norms are not necessarily written or have been written from day one. This is it's customary law and it evolves over time. So this is not going to amend or change the status of constitutional status of cities tomorrow morning, but it definitely will help in creating momentum and creating the political will and creating the public awareness of the issue. And so when we go to vote, we express our political wish for politicians to address this issue. So the more we work in that direction, it's not a direct replacement to constitutional change, but it's essentially definitely an engine or a complementary means that may enhance over time the constitutional status itself.
Considering megacities also have a great concentration of wealth, which funds many of their welfare policies, would granting them greater constitutional status aid redistribution beyond the city?
Yes, so that's a big question, big question. So I have a number of things to say about this. I mean, will it aid? I don't know, I can only speculate, but it's a major issue. So of course the conventional wisdom is that cities are very wealthy. But first of all, we need to set the record straight. A very small fraction of city residents is very wealthy, and the vast majority are not. And the socioeconomic differences within metropolises, including in Toronto, are stunning and far exceed the socioeconomic differences, again, as I said, across the country, if we based our comparison on interprovincial. So we always want to think, the maritime provinces are less off, as some of them, and sometimes Alberta, not now, but before the oil crisis, and other provinces are much better off, etc. But the differences are not even 1-2 on ratio. The differences here in Toronto are 1-6, and in New York 1-13, and in Mumbai 1-21, and so on and so on. So first of all, just to make so that we understand this, it's not the dichotomy of cities are the place of the haves and rural areas are places of the have-nots. This is just not accurate, and we need to be much more precise in our analysis of city status and who lives in cities and so on. Secondly, another issue is that because cities cities are anchored in place, they cannot move. We know of capital flight, the possibility. We cannot think of city flight. You cannot transform Toronto to the Emirates because there is oil there. So let's go there. We can't do this. So Toronto is stuck where it is, and corporations come and go. So that creates, and so if you add to that lack of constitutional status, the only way and lack of appropriate taxation authority, that creates an embedded systemic, inherent dependency of city governance on some corporate interest, because the only way to move things forward is all those joint ventures, business, city, unless you want to, go to the province or go to the federal government. And in many cases, it's just joint venture of all four, quote unquote, orders of governments. It's the city and business and province and the federal government. So by enhancing or empowering the constitutional status of cities, we might think of a situation where the taxation and fiscal autonomy of cities will increase. And over time, I would think that the pressure for intra-metropolis distribution would have its impact. So again, it's anybody's guess, but my sense is the more awareness we have to the localities we live in and to the people who live around us, might increase the likelihood of redistribution of wealth intra-city. And I suggest in the book that the equalization notion, the fiscal equalization notion that we have established in many federal countries, may be applied in a creative way to intra-metropolis redistribution. And we need to think about, what's the unit here? Neighborhood. It's difficult. Let me also say one more thing. I know that Cheryl has more questions to ask, but let me say one more thing here, and that's a challenge. The rural-urban dichotomy is inaccurate in itself. It's easy to portray things in that way, but a significant part of urban growth worldwide has taken the form of what we refer to as suburban. So it's not that, every person either lives in a city or in a small village in some remote place. It's just inaccurate. And there is a very broad band of the suburban. So when we come to design city power, one of the challenges is that cities are very different from states. States have borders, have citizenship, members, have passports. We come, we go, the state monitors where we are in, we are out legally. Cities is very difficult to do this. And it's, there are no borders, no citizenship, no passports, etc. So one of the major challenges, and when we design a constitutional standing for cities, and this is applicable for redistribution as well, is who is a member of the urban demos, so to speak, and how to define the urban demos in a way that does justice to members of the community. Where to draw the line here? What is the community? It's a challenge. Thanks.
So I think we just have time for this one more question, and it's kind of a double-barreled one. So in some contexts, municipal political parties are highly vertically integrated with national and supranational political parties. For example, in most European countries, there are green parties from the municipal all the way up to the European level. In others, they are not integrated at all, for example, in Canada. Does this vertical integration have an impact on the saliency of cities at the national constitutional level? Or is the relation the opposite? In other words, what is the role of national political parties in promoting or hampering municipal empowerment?
Yes, an excellent question in comparative politics that I scratched the surface of this in the book. This is, I think, an area of tremendous area for research. What's the impact of the political system, not necessarily the constitutional system, but the political system, including the political party structure in a given country, on the actual representation of cities. So in an inconclusive way, I will speculate that the more integrated the party system is, that is, the same parties run on an urban platform, on a lander, let's say Germany, because this is the example the person who asked the question referred to, in the federal level, the more integrated it is, the greater the likelihood that there will be an attempt at the national level and at the subnational level to cater to the interests of urban dwellers, of urban residents, not for the love of the city, but for the love of the political vote, of course. And so, again, this is not a constitutional question, but my speculation here is that, and I address this in part in the book, the more integrated the party system is, nationally, regionally, locally, the greater the likelihood that urban interests will be properly represented. But again, this is subject for empirical research, and I can only scratch the surface of this. Let me just say in conclusion, because I understand that this is the final question, two things. One is that I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to address more questions. Obviously, you have to remember this is a first take on an issue. If we compare the issue of urban governance and constitutional law to how many, the mountains of writings we have on freedom of expression, on freedom of religion, on federalism, on you name it, any other constitutional issue, just name it. We have mountains on this. When it comes to urban agglomeration in cities, we have very few nation-based accounts and close to nothing or nothing from a comparative perspective. So obviously, I take all those fascinating questions, and I'm sure there are more, as an indication that the time has come to engage in such a conversation from a broad, comparative constitutional perspective, and hopefully in an attempt to enrich the discussion of our own constitutional landscape here in Canada. The final thing I'll say is that, of course, I remain interested in all your questions. So if you want, and you should feel free to email me, and all my details are available online. I cannot promise a quick response, but I can promise that I will respond. So thank you very much for tuning in. Buy the book. It's a good one.
Thank you very much, Professor Hirschl. This was a fascinating topic. It's so timely because of the City of Toronto litigation coming up. But there are lots of other issues with climate change, et cetera, that you've given us a lot of food for thought. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.